They put me in a nursing home last Tuesday, and by Wednesday morning, I had already withdrawn $2.3 million from accounts they didn't think I understood, and by Thursday, I was gone. I didn't cry when my son said it would be better for everyone. I didn't argue when my daughter-in-law folded her hands on the table and spoke slowly, as if I might miss something important. I just nodded, the way I had learned to do over the years when conversations stopped including me and started happening around me instead. At 72, people assume your world has become smaller, quieter, easier to manage. They assume confusion where there is actually silence, weakness where there is simply patience. My name is Margaret Whitmore, and for the past 3 years since my husband passed, I had lived alone in the same Oregon house we bought together in 1989, the one with the white porch railing he painted every spring. I paid my bills on time, clipped coupons out of habit, and kept my routine steady. I trusted my son, Daniel, because I raised him to be someone worth trusting. And I tolerated Emily, his wife, because I believed love required a certain amount of endurance. The first time she asked about my finances, it sounded casual, almost caring. Just making sure everything's set up properly, she said with that careful smile that never quite reached her eyes. Then she started offering to help, organizing paperwork, simplifying accounts, suggesting automatic payments. I let her, because it felt easier than explaining that I already knew what I was doing. Somewhere along the way, things shifted. Statements stopped arriving in the mail. Emails were taken care of. Passwords were updated for security. Daniel stopped asking questions and started repeating hers. And I watched it all happen the way you watch rain gather on a window, slow at first, then all at once. The night they told me about the nursing home, the dining room felt colder than usual. My son wouldn't look at me. Emily spoke in that measured tone again, outlining options I hadn't asked for, decisions I hadn't made. It's just temporary, Daniel added, as if that would soften it. I remember looking down at my hands, noticing how still they were. No shaking, no hesitation, just stillness. That was the moment I understood something important. They weren't asking. They had already decided who I was and what I was capable of. They had already written the ending to my story. What they didn't know was that I had been paying attention the entire time. Every missing statement, every transfer I didn't authorize, every quiet change made under the assumption that I wouldn't notice. I didn't confront them. I didn't raise my voice. I simply began to prepare. Because sometimes, the most dangerous thing you can do is underestimate someone who has nothing left to prove and everything left to take back. I did not sleep that night after they told me about the arrangement, not because I was afraid, but because my mind was finally clear in a way it had not been for years. When you stop expecting kindness, you begin to see patterns. I sat at my kitchen table before sunrise, the same place where my husband used to read the newspaper, and I opened the folder I had quietly started building months ago. It was nothing dramatic at first, just small things that did not feel right. A bank statement that never arrived. A password that suddenly stopped working. A polite message from Emily saying she had streamlined my accounts to make things easier. At the time, I had thanked her. That morning, I read every line again, slowly, carefully, like someone learning a new language. The numbers told a story I had not wanted to hear before. Transfers made on dates I did not recognize. Payments scheduled to places I had never authorized. Changes made in a sequence that felt too organized to be accidental. I poured myself a cup of coffee and let it go cold as I traced each transaction with the tip of my finger. 2,000 here, 5,000 there. Always small enough to avoid attention, but steady enough to build into something significant over time. I thought about the way Emily had started sitting closer during family dinners, how she would answer questions directed at me, how Daniel would nod along as if everything had already been decided. It was never loud, never confrontational, just quiet adjustments, one after another, until my life no longer felt like mine. By mid-morning, I drove to the bank branch I had used for over 30 years. The building had been renovated, brighter and more modern, but the manager, Mr. Collins, still recognized me the moment I stepped inside. He smiled the way people do when they remember who you used to be. We sat in his office, and I asked him to walk me through every account connected to my name. Not just the ones I could see online, but everything. He hesitated at first, not out of suspicion, but out of concern, as if he thought the information might overwhelm me. I assured him I was not overwhelmed. I was ready. When he turned his screen toward me, the full picture came into focus. Accounts I had not opened. Transfers routed through permissions I did not recall granting. And then, at the bottom of the list, a number that made everything else fall into place. $2.3 million, sitting in a consolidated account under my name, quietly managed, quietly controlled. For a moment, I said nothing. I simply looked at it, letting the reality settle in. They had not just been preparing to move me. They had been preparing to take everything with them. I thanked Mr. Collins, asked a few careful questions, and wrote down what I needed to remember. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse anyone. I walked out of that bank with the same calm expression I had worn at dinner the night before. But something inside me had shifted completely. I was no longer reacting to what they had planned. I was deciding what would happen next. That afternoon, I returned home and placed the folder back in the same drawer where it had always been, as if nothing had changed, as if I had not just uncovered the quiet architecture of a plan that did not include me. The house felt different now, not because anything had moved, but because I could finally see it clearly. Every room held a memory, but also a pattern I had ignored. The way Emily had insisted on reorganizing the filing cabinet last winter. The way Daniel had started handling the bigger decisions without asking. Even the way they spoke to me had shifted, softer in tone, but firmer in direction, like they were guiding someone who could no longer guide herself. I moved through the kitchen slowly, rinsing my coffee cup, drying it, placing it back in the cabinet with the others. Routine had always been my anchor, and now it became my cover. When Daniel called that evening, his voice was careful, almost rehearsed. He asked if I had thought about what they discussed, if I was comfortable with the transition. I told him I trusted his judgment. There was a pause on the other end of the line, a small exhale, the sound of relief. He thanked me, as if I had just agreed to something generous. I could hear Emily in the background, asking something quietly, and Daniel answered her before returning to me, his tone lighter now, almost cheerful. They believed the conversation was over. They believed I had accepted the role they had written for me. The next morning, I began to adjust my behavior in ways that felt almost invisible but were very deliberate. I asked simple questions I already knew the answers to. I let small details slip, misplacing my reading glasses, forgetting where I had set my keys, allowing moments of hesitation to stretch just long enough to be noticed. Not enough to alarm, just enough to confirm what they already suspected. When Emily visited later that week, she watched me closely, her eyes scanning the room the way she always did, as if taking inventory. I greeted her warmly, offered her tea, and let her take the lead in every conversation. She spoke about timelines, about availability at the facility, about how quickly things could be arranged if we acted proactively. I nodded at the right moments, asked gentle questions, and never once challenged her assumptions. Inside, I was measuring everything. The timing, the urgency, the confidence in her voice. By the time she left, I knew exactly how certain they were that I would not resist. That certainty was the one thing they had not protected against. Over the next 2 days, I made quiet calls from my landline, the one number they had never bothered to monitor. I confirmed account access with the bank, verified identification protocols, and arranged a meeting that would not appear on any shared calendar. Each step was small, ordinary, almost forgettable. But together, they formed something much larger. I did not rush. I did not panic. I simply moved forward, one decision at a time, with the same steady rhythm I had used to build my life all those years ago. Because this was not about reacting to what they had done. This was about taking back what they believed I no longer understood how to protect. The meeting at the bank was scheduled for 9:30 in the morning, a time that felt ordinary enough to avoid attention, yet early enough to give me the entire day ahead. I arrived 10 minutes early, as I always had, and sat in the waiting area watching the quiet rhythm of people coming and going, each of them carrying their own concerns, their own numbers, their own lives. When Mr. Collins greeted me, there was a subtle shift in his expression, not confusion, not doubt, but recognition. He understood that I was not there for reassurance anymore. I was there to act. We reviewed everything again, slowly, deliberately, confirming access points, verifying identification, and outlining the steps required to move the funds in a way that was both legal and immediate. I asked questions not because I needed the answers, but because I wanted to hear them spoken out loud, to anchor each decision in clarity. When he mentioned the total again, $2.3 million. His voice carried a quiet weight, as if acknowledging the significance of what I was about to do. I nodded, signed where necessary, and authorized the transfers without hesitation. There was no dramatic moment, no sudden realization, just the steady movement of numbers from one place to another, each transaction closing a door they thought they had already locked behind me. By the time I stood up to leave, everything had been set in motion. The accounts they monitored would appear unchanged for now, a delay built into the system that would give me exactly the window I needed. I thanked Mr. Collins, not with emotion, but with sincerity, and walked out into the cool Oregon air feeling something I had not felt in a long time. Not relief, not anger, control. Back at home, I moved through my routine with the same quiet precision. I packed a single suitcase, nothing excessive, only what I could carry without drawing attention. A few changes of clothes, important documents, the photograph of my husband standing by the porch he loved so much. I left everything else exactly where it belonged. The dishes were clean. The bed was made. The curtains were half open, just the way I preferred them in the afternoon light. When Daniel called later that evening to confirm the move scheduled for the next day, I answered calmly. I told him I was ready. He sounded relieved again, almost grateful that things were going smoothly. Emily took the phone briefly, her voice warm, reassuring, already speaking as if the decision had been finalized long ago. I listened, responded when necessary, and said nothing more. After the call ended, I sat in the living room for a while, looking around at the life I had built, the one they believed I was ready to leave behind. They thought they were moving me out. What they did not understand was that I had already left in every way that mattered. The next morning, when they arrived to take me to the facility, I would walk out that door with them, just as expected. And by the time they realized what had truly happened, there would be nothing left for them to manage, nothing left for them to control, and no one left for them to underestimate. They arrived at exactly 8:15 the next morning, right on time, just as Emily had planned it, efficient and controlled, as if this were a simple appointment rather than the quiet removal of a life from its place. I was already dressed, my suitcase placed neatly by the front door, my coat folded over my arm. Daniel knocked once before letting himself in. His expression a mixture of concern and relief, the kind people where when they believe they are doing the right thing, even if they have not fully examined why. Emily followed behind him, her eyes scanning the room immediately, taking in the details, confirming that everything was proceeding according to expectation. "You are ready," she said, not as a question, but as a conclusion. I smiled and nodded, the same calm expression I had practiced, the same quiet acceptance they had come to rely on. Daniel picked up my suitcase without asking what was inside. He did not need to. In his mind, everything important had already been handled, organized, secured. We walked out together, the three of us, and I paused for just a moment on the porch, not to hesitate, but to remember. The railing still held the faint marks of fresh paint from years ago, and the morning air carried that familiar Oregon chill that settles into your bones if you stand still long enough. I did not linger. I stepped forward, closed the door behind me, and let the sound of the latch settle into place. The drive was quiet. Emily spoke occasionally about the facility, about how comfortable it would be, how attentive the staff were, how everything had been arranged with care. Daniel added small reassurances, repeating phrases that sounded practiced, as if they had been discussed beforehand. I listened, responding when necessary, allowing the conversation to move without interruption. They were filling the silence, not me. When we arrived, the building stood clean and well-maintained, with wide windows and trimmed hedges that suggested calm and order. It looked exactly like the kind of place people choose when they believe they are making a responsible decision for someone else. Inside, the staff greeted us politely, their voices warm but measured, accustomed to transitions like this. Papers were presented, forms explained, signatures requested. Emily took the lead again, answering questions before they reached me, guiding the process with a confidence that came from believing everything was already settled. I signed where I needed to, my hand steady, my expression unchanged. The room they showed me was simple, clean, with a bed, a chair, and a window that looked out onto a small garden. It was not unpleasant. That was not the point. Daniel placed my suitcase by the bed and turned to me with a look that searched for something, perhaps gratitude, perhaps reassurance. I gave him a small nod, the same one I had given the night before. Emily checked her watch, already thinking ahead, already moving on to whatever came next in her plan. They did not stay long. A few final words, a gentle touch on my shoulder, a promise to visit soon. Then they were gone. I stood there for a moment after the door closed, listening to the quiet settle around me. No anger, no fear, just clarity. I walked to the window, looked out at the garden, and waited. Because I knew something they did not. By the time they reached their car, by the time they started the engine and drove away believing everything was under control, the process I had set in motion the day before was already moving forward without them. And in a matter of hours, the version of me they had placed in that room would no longer exist. Time inside that room moved differently, not slower, not faster, just quieter, as if everything had been softened to make people more manageable. I sat on the edge of the bed for a few minutes after they left, not because I was uncertain, but because I was waiting for the right moment to begin. The hallway outside carried faint sounds of footsteps, distant conversations, the steady rhythm of a place designed for routine. I placed my purse on the small table by the window and opened it carefully, checking once more that everything I needed was exactly where it should be. Identification, documents, a small envelope with the final confirmations from the bank. Nothing excessive, nothing that would draw attention. I stood up, walked to the door, and opened it without hesitation. No one stopped me. No one questioned where I was going. That was the first assumption they made, that once I was inside, I would stay inside. I moved down the hallway at a measured pace, neither hurried nor hesitant, just another resident adjusting to a new space. When I reached the front desk, I offered a polite smile and said I needed some fresh air, that I had not yet had the chance to see the grounds. The receptionist nodded without concern, her attention already shifting to something else on her screen. The door opened with a soft click, and just like that, I stepped outside. The air felt different than it had earlier that morning, lighter somehow, or perhaps I was the one who had changed. I walked past the trimmed hedges, past the small garden I had seen from the window, and continued toward the parking area without looking back. A car was waiting exactly where it was supposed to be, not new, not noticeable, just another vehicle among many. The driver did not speak. He did not need to. Everything had already been arranged through a service that asked no unnecessary questions and kept no unnecessary records. I opened the door, settled into the back seat, and placed my purse beside me. As the car pulled away, I allowed myself one brief glance at the building in the distance, not with regret, but with understanding. They had chosen that place because it made them feel responsible, because it allowed them to believe they were solving a problem. What they never considered was that I might not be the problem at all. The road ahead stretched out in quiet lines, familiar at first, then gradually less so as we moved farther from everything they knew about me. My phone remained silent, exactly as I expected. It would take time before they noticed anything, time before the systems updated, before the numbers changed, before the absence became undeniable. I leaned back against the seat, closed my eyes for a moment, and let the motion of the car carry me forward. I was not running. I was not escaping. I was simply moving on my own terms, for the first time in a very long while. And by the time they realized that the version of me they thought they understood no longer existed, I would already be somewhere they could not reach, holding on to a life they never believed I was capable of reclaiming. The farther we drove, the less familiar the landscape became, and with every mile that passed, I felt the weight of expectation fall away in quiet layers. There was no dramatic moment, no sudden release, just a gradual shift from being watched to being unseen. The driver followed the route exactly as arranged, avoiding highways that required identification checks, choosing smaller roads that stretched through towns where no one knew my name and no one had reason to ask. I kept my gaze on the window, watching the scenery change from dense Oregon trees to open stretches of land, the kind that made you feel both small and free at the same time. After a few hours, we stopped at a modest gas station just outside a town I had never visited before. The driver stepped out to refuel, and I remained inside, still, composed, as if this were just another ordinary day. I checked my phone once, not for messages, but for confirmation. The updates had begun. Notifications appeared quietly, one after another, each one marking the completion of a step I had already anticipated. Accounts finalized. Transfers completed. Access points closed. There was no alarm, no interruption, just the silent execution of a plan that had been set in motion long before they realized they had lost control. By the time the driver returned and we continued on, there was nothing left behind that could be traced back to me in any meaningful way. Hours later, we reached the next destination, a small town near the coast where the air carried a faint trace of salt and the streets moved at a slower pace. The car stopped in front of a modest rental home, nothing extravagant, nothing that would attract attention. I stepped out, carrying only my suitcase and my purse, and paused for a moment to take in the quiet. This was not an escape. It was a transition. Inside, the house was simple but comfortable, already prepared with the essentials. A bed made with clean sheets, a kitchen stocked with basic groceries, a small table by the window where the afternoon light settled softly across the surface. I placed my belongings down and moved through the space slowly, not to inspect it, but to understand it, to let it become mine in the way my previous home once had. When I finally sat down, I allowed myself a moment to reflect, not on what I had left behind, but on what had led me here. The careful questions, the quiet observations, the decision not to react when reacting would have changed nothing. Somewhere, back in the life I had just stepped away from, Daniel and Emily were still moving through their day, unaware that the structure they had built around me had already collapsed. They would notice soon. The calls would begin. The confusion would grow. But by then, the version of me they believed they could manage would no longer exist. I was not hidden. I was not lost. I was simply no longer within their reach, and for the first time in years, every decision that followed would belong entirely to me. The first night in that house was quieter than I expected, not unsettling, just unfamiliar in a way that made every small sound more noticeable. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, marking time in a space that had no history attached to me yet. I sat by the window as the light faded, watching the sky shift from pale gray to a deeper shade of blue, and I realized something I had not felt in years. No one knew where I was. No one was about to walk through the door unannounced. No one was making decisions for me in another room. That silence was not emptiness. It was space. I kept my phone turned off for most of the evening, not out of fear, but out of intention. There was nothing. I needed to hear from them. Not yet. When I finally powered it on, the screen filled with missed calls and messages, each one more urgent than the last. Daniel's name appeared again and again, followed by short messages that started with confusion and quickly turned into concern. Emily's messages were different, more controlled, more precise, questions that sounded calm on the surface but carried a sharper edge underneath. Where are you? Why did you leave? Call us immediately. I read each one without reacting, without feeling the need to respond. They were not reaching out to understand. They were trying to regain control of something they had already lost. I placed the phone back on the table and let the room settle around me again. The next morning, I woke up early, just as I always had, but this time there was no routine waiting to pull me into someone else's expectations. I made coffee, stood by the kitchen counter, and allowed myself to move slowly, deliberately, choosing each action without urgency. Outside, the town was beginning to wake up, cars passing occasionally, a few people walking along the sidewalk, all of it distant enough to remain anonymous. Later that day, I walked into a local bank branch, not to repeat what had already been done, but to establish something new. A fresh account. A clean start. The manager asked routine questions, verified my identification, and processed everything without hesitation. To him, I was just another customer, someone passing through, someone building something quietly. That anonymity was exactly what I needed. By the afternoon, everything had been secured again, not hidden, not rushed, just carefully placed where only I could access it. When I returned to the house, I noticed how natural it already felt to close the door behind me, to set my keys down, to exist in a space that did not carry the weight of someone else's decisions. I thought briefly about the moment they would fully understand what had happened. The empty accounts, the unanswered calls, the realization that the version of me they had planned around had simply stepped out of the structure they built. I did not feel satisfaction. I did not feel anger. I felt clarity. They had believed that moving me into that room would simplify their lives, that it would reduce me to something manageable, something predictable. What they never considered was that I had spent a lifetime building, protecting, and understanding everything they thought they could quietly take. And now, for the first time, I was no longer protecting it for them. I was protecting it for myself. By the third day, the calls had stopped coming as frequently, not because they had given up, but because the realization had begun to settle in. Confusion can only sustain urgency for so long before it turns into something quieter, something heavier. I imagined Daniel sitting at the kitchen table, the same one where he once did his homework while I prepared dinner, staring at numbers that no longer made sense. I imagined Emily reviewing every document, every account, retracing steps that had once felt so controlled, now unraveling in ways she could not immediately fix. They would look for explanations first, then for someone to blame, and eventually, they would have to confront something far more difficult. They had misunderstood me completely. That morning, I walked along the edge of the coastal road, the air cool and steady, the sound of the ocean just loud enough to remind me that the world was much larger than the small space they had tried to confine me to. I carried nothing with me but my keys and my thoughts, both lighter than they had been in years. There was no need to rush into anything new. No need to prove anything to anyone. For so long, every decision I made had been tied to someone else, to a role I was expected to fulfill, to a version of myself that was slowly being rewritten without my consent. Now, there was only quiet intention. Later that afternoon, I sat at the small table by the window and wrote a single letter. Not long, not emotional, just clear. I addressed it to Daniel, not because Emily did not deserve answers, but because some things are better understood without an audience. I told him that I was safe, that I had made my own arrangements, and that he did not need to look for me. I did not explain the details. I did not list what I had discovered or how long I had known. I simply wrote one sentence that I knew he would read more than once. I was never confused. I was watching. I sealed the envelope and arranged for it to be sent without a return address, not to disappear completely, but to leave behind exactly what I chose to leave behind. That evening, as the light faded again, I sat in the same chair by the window and allowed the silence to settle around me, not as something empty, but as something earned. They had believed that removing me from my home would simplify their lives, that placing me in that room would make everything easier to manage. What they did not understand was that they were not removing me from anything. They were revealing themselves. And once I saw them clearly, there was no reason to stay where I was no longer respected, no longer included, no longer seen for who I truly was. I did not disappear out of anger. I did not leave to punish them. I left because I finally understood that the life I had built was never meant to be handed over to someone who saw it as an opportunity instead of a responsibility. And now, for the first time in a very long time, every quiet morning, every simple decision, every step forward belonged entirely to me.